Hello, everybody. How you doing? Well, I don't get an answer from that. I want to say a few words about the two pieces of mine that are being performed. The early one from 1948, is a kind of strange little piece. Strange, at least for the instrumentation. I don't think any piece for horn, viola, and oboe had ever been written before, and it's in three movements, contrasting movements. There is a fascinating story, fascinating to me in retrospect because this is so long ago, but I'd like to tell that. I was living at the time in a abandoned Greek Orthodox church. When I say abandoned, it wasn't destroyed or anything, but it had been. There was this big building which later became the Union for 802 in New York. Anyway, my friend Joe Marks, a remarkable oboe player from that time, he lived in the top floor, the fifth floor, were what were called the bishop's quarters, and there seemed to have been two bishops. I don't understand Greek Orthodoxy. But anyway, I lived in one and he in the other, and in between there was this huge area which it was either a gymnasium or it could be used for dancing, for training, ballet dancing, because there were some bars on the walls still, from somebody that used it before. But anyway, Joe and I decided two things: to have some concerts in this big place. Just get the chairs, or we could sit on mattresses or whatever, and so we initiated a series. I think it was every Thursday evening. He was playing at the Met and I was playing at the Met. Every Thursday, if we were free, unless we were putting on our... So once a month we gave these concerts. I had known Joe for already 5 years at that time, and he had many wonderful qualities. He was a great publisher, he was a remarkable musician, and he also had this other thing where he liked to tease people with weird little things, and he always challenged me to something that he thought I couldn't do. One time on tour with the Met in Toronto, he dared me to eat 12 Sundays, what was it called? Fruit salad Sundays. And I did eat them, but man, I had some weird nightmares that night. I mean, he always came up with some, I bet you can't do this, can't you do that. So this time he came up with this idea, and it was on a Sunday afternoon. And there was a concert scheduled, I think, for Wednesday or Thursday. And he said to me, you think you're so good, and I was a pretty fluent writer, and he knew that. He admired my writing, by the way. And he said, I bet you can't write a piece in time for this concert, which also meant learning it. I said, of course I took up the challenge. By the way, I won every challenge with him. So I decided to write this piece, and as I say, I was pretty fluent. I didn't sleep very much. I just wrote these three movements in these 2 or 3 days. We had one little rehearsal before the actual concert. And of course, I had to decide on, well, what kind of piece should it be? I mean, for what instruments? So naturally, I put myself in as a horn player and Joe as the oboist. And one of our most favorite colleagues was the John Diani, who was the first principal violist of the Metropolitan Orchestra, and he always participated in our concerts. So it turned out this piece came out for oboe and horn and viola. It was a difficult piece for me to write, actually, because I always like very rich and full harmonies. Now, when you have two instruments that can't play double stops. I mean, we know about multiphonics on the horn and the oboe, okay, but That didn't exist yet. And so the only instrument that could play even two notes was the viola in any sustained way. I mean, you can play a four-part chord, but so it was for me to write with only four pitches at any given time was not the ideal thing for me, because I'd been brought up on Wagner and Brahms and Scriabin and all this harmonically very rich music. And so it turns out that the viola player has three functions, because, of course, his or her own part, and then has to supply some of the harmonies, that's second, and third is in fact basically the bass instrument in the group. Okay, the horn can play low, and I use some low horn, but for most of the piece, the viola was the bass. Well, so I figured all that out, and it turned out to be quite a lovely little piece. And of course, Joe first, he sort of tapped me on the shoulder. He says, "Well, I kind of knew you could do it." And we played it that night to a small audience. And by the way, I had a very easy high register and also a very wide range, like 4.5 octaves. And so I wrote myself some very intervallically challenging things, gigantic leaps, as in Webern's music, which I was very enamored with at the time, and including a lot of high notes, and of course also some very low notes where you think suddenly a tuba has come into the room. And so the oboe part is, of course, mostly melodic and occasionally technically challenging. Joe was the first to try to play, one of the first oboists, I think maybe in France there was somebody, play above the high F that was the limit on the oboe in the 19th century. So I wrote some F sharps and Gs and A flats and some low notes, and he was an incredible technician. He could play atonal music just almost at sight, And John did an amazing job with fulfilling these three positions in this game. So that's what happened. Anyway, I think, let me see. The first movement starts with a viola, which I was still writing somewhat thematically in those days. I mean, clearly thematic, as in classical music, where there's a theme stated and others stated, and you work it, and the viola presents that. And this is all 12th tone already, yeah. And the second movement is scherzo, which uses always the same row, and it has this sort of bouncy theme, da 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 da. If you sing it tonally, it becomes Hindemith, but this way it was atonal. And then the last movement is a slow elegiac, is that the word? Where there's an undulating figure in the viola, again playing two notes at a time. Dee-da, dee-da, endlessly going on, very placid. The oboes adding one more note, and I'm going da-ee, da-ee, and I think making a very interesting melody, although most people who hear a melody that makes leaps of minor ninths, they don't think of that as melody. It's got to be in conjunct motion, or as in Rachmaninoff or in Brahms, which of course is great. But I was experimenting, and the very last bars, it was the first time I undertook this. There had crept into the atonal 12-tone music a kind of pointillism with some composers. So the final movement just sort of evaporates, it all thins out, and there's just isolated peeps and poops left over. And so anyway, I hope you enjoy that. And as for the other piece, that's a piano quartet, which has a subtitle of On Light Wings, and it has 4 movements. One is called Impromptu, but it's basically in an adagio tempo. Here I had, of course, access to a richer harmonic language. I mean, if you play double stops on the four instruments, or of course on the piano you can play 11 notes if you have 11 fingers. I mean, you can play a lot of notes. So it's a much denser harmonic language, and this was composed in 1984. Yeah, that's the first one was in 48. This was in 84, and it's of course already in my much more advanced 12-tone style. But my music always harkens back to the past. I think that's because, by that I mean that there are certain things that I, as a musician, a performer, and a conductor of all the classical literature from Bach on up, I always have this feeling of wanting to not totally disconnect myself from the past. So that in that sense, my music is sort of classical in many respects, even though the language is totally non-functional tonality. So that's what makes it different. But melodically, a lot of it is fairly familiar. The second movement is a scherzo also, in which there are some gigantic collisions between all the instruments, especially at the end, with the piece going sort of crazy. At one point, the first violin is playing something very linear, dee da 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 da, something like that, and underneath the viola is playing harmonic, da 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 da, rhythm moving. The cello answers the violin with sort of aggressive counterpoint figures, and the piano is playing in a totally different meter. The string music is in 4/4, and the piano music is in 3/2, like large triplets across the measure. So then you get a lot of rhythmic variety vertically. And then in the final movement, I called it Bagatelle. I don't know whether this is the first time that I wrote jazz things for a chamber music piece. I wrote jazz pieces much earlier, but you know, at that time, even in 1984, in the 80s, it was still very difficult to find string players who played jazz, liked jazz. You know, most of them looked down their noses at it, but I knew that Juan Ramirez, for whom I wrote this, he was in the Atlanta Symphony at the time, and he had been my concertmaster at the New England Conservatory. And he was Mexican, and he loved dance music of all kinds, and I knew that he could handle the sort of the swing element in jazz. But of course, it is not swing a la Glenn Miller. I mean, I was all writing atonal jazz. And of course, this has made this piece, the inclusion of jazz has made this piece one of the most claimed and recorded of my pieces. And it goes quite wild at certain times. Not much is vertically coordinated. Everybody's sort of doing their own thing. There's even some foot stamping and finger snapping at the end. And again, it's one of those, I think it's one of those pieces where at the end it sort of thins out and becomes very quiet and sustained. And then in the final bar has one fortissimo, one bar coda. So, and this piece, again, the movements are an impromptu, which is mostly adagio. Then there's a scherzo. The third one I call a fantasia, and it again in a very slow, lento movement. So I think the best way to listen to my music is not to figure out or to expect any you know, themes or melodies as in the 19th century. One has to listen to not only my music, but any other kind of this 12-tone music highly chromatic music. One has to listen to it holistically and just take the whole sound in, both, vertically and horizontally, and not try to figure out what the heck's going on. You're not going to hear da 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 or ba dee da dee da da da. No, maybe something like that, but again, atonalized. So listen, just close your eyes and listen to it and take it in. And I say that partially, it's good advice. Don't be offended, because when you close your eyes, you really listen. But when you open your eyes, you're watching the players. There's not that much interesting. I mean, young Nam Kim is just going to move his bow up and down forever, and whatnot, and the pianist's going to scramble around on the piano. But, after a while, that isn't all that novel or interesting. But if you close your eyes, you will really hear much more, I guarantee it. Even though you won't know that you're hearing more. I'm telling it to you now in advance. Okay, have great fun with it.